Ukraine actually did bomb directly a residential area where there were civilians, and there was absolutely no reason for them to do that. And you knew that because it was US supplied HIMARS that were used. It really changes your process as a journalist when you actually have put like a human aspect to what you're doing versus just hearing this data. Once you come here, even just coming to Moscow, it really does give you a different perspective. And of course, going to Donbass, you know that this is very real. You know that this is not a both sides situation.
Hello, comrades, and welcome to the Revolution Report. Those of you who know me very well know that I've been in Donbass many times. You've also seen our documentary that we've written about the Donbass conflict, the documentary called 8 Years Before. And I'm also really happy to say that today we have a very special guest on the channel. We've got an exclusive interview with a very close friend, comrade, and colleague of mine, Fiorella Isabel, who is also a host on the Convo Couch, and she actually had the very unique opportunity to visit Donbass for herself and see what the situation was like there. Of course, last time we were there, it was before the special military operation, but Fiorella was able to go there after and see what the situation on the ground there is like right now. So Fiorella, thanks a lot for joining us on the Revolution Report, giving us your time for this interview and everything. So, first of all, I just want to ask basically, why did you come up with the idea of going to Donbass, and how did you set everything up to do that?
Yeah, so I've been wanting to go. One of the reasons why I wanted to come to Moscow was to really see what was going on in the area. Most people in independent media where I came from had not been talking about Donbass in the right way. Even, of course, people that usually were okay on other conflicts, because the perceived motion was that Putin invaded Ukraine and that this started in February of 2022. A lot of people, only hear one side of the story. They see the mainstream media headlines, and not even just mainstream media, but every single headline. Oh, look what Russia did. They just bombed this hospital. They just bombed these residential areas of civilians. So one of the things I wanted to do while also being here was, I thought it would be a crime not to go to Donbass and really see what the situation was there. And so I had one of my friends, Dan Kovalik, who went, and I contacted him and tried to figure out how he went. And I sort of went that way, but it was a tight schedule because, at RT, I didn't really have too much time off. So it was interesting to do the whole process because, of course, because of the sanctions, it takes a while to get there, to get to Rostov and then to get to Donbass. And so I had to make sure I had enough time. So that's kind of how it came about. I had been wanting to really, really just assess the situation for myself because so many people also called me a propagandist and all of this stuff. So I wanted to do something that was on my own, and sort of go that route. So, yeah.
Well, you're definitely right that, a lot of people in the West and in other parts of the world as well have sort of a skewed understanding of what this conflict is all about. There's a lot of controversy just around the way people label what's going on. Some people call it a war, other people call it a special military operation, but I was having a conversation the other day with George Galloway, and I thought about clarifying this because it's kind of a war and a special military operation, right? Because Russia launched its special military operation in 2022 to end a war that was going on from 2014 that was completely, basically orchestrated by the West, by the European Union, NATO, the United States, that put this fascist-backed government in power in Kiev that we're now seeing cause all of this destruction. And it was, so when there's all these protesters that seem to be pro-Kiev saying no war, it's really ironic to me because the people who really were trying to end this war all along were the Russians who launched this military operation. So I wanted to ask you, what exactly did you see there? And like, how long were you there? Did you meet with officials? What was the trip like?
Yeah, I was able to meet with some officials from the government in Donbass. We were able to go to Makiivka and a few other neighboring cities in the region because it's a big region, as you know. We were in Donetsk city, and one of the things I saw immediately there. It was a pretty short trip. It was like a 6 day trip, and -2 days, so it was like a week trip, and then I was there for like 4 days, I would say. And it was immediately very, very obvious who the aggressor was when we got there. Immediately we went to this area that had been bombed in the center of Donetsk, and it was a residential area. It was flats, apartments, and a supermarket area, and that had been bombed a day before we got there. And I got there Wednesday, so it was like bombed Monday, actually, and morning. And you weren't hearing anything about that. You were only hearing about an intercepted missile that Russia hit. And of course, you weren't hearing about the intercepted part. You were just hearing that Russia bombed these residential apartments. It was during that time, because it was about a month ago that I went. And Russia bombed an apartment with 60 people were killed, and that was all over the news. But you weren't hearing what actually happened was that Russia had intercepted, or Ukraine had intercepted a missile. And they keep doing that, knowing that that's actually going to hurt the people in these regions, because Russia's never aiming at the residential areas. So you were hearing all about that, but you weren't hearing about the fact that Ukraine actually did bomb directly a residential area where there were civilians, and there was absolutely no reason for them to do that. And you knew that because it was US supplied HIMARS that were used, and locals pretty much confirmed that story, that it was US supplied HIMARS. We know they have a specific look, we know they have a specific label, so there was no denying that, right? And being there and seeing these the people that were previously living in this apartment going through the rubble to find, whatever could be salvaged, to find their documents, to find whatever, you really saw what this is. This is real. This isn't something that's just on the news, because when we work, sometimes we get desensitized when we're talking about statistics, when we're talking about facts, and it really, now being there and seeing it, when I talk about this stuff, it's a little bit different, because I know exactly what I'm talking about. When you say, two people died, 3 people died, these were actual people. This actually happened. This is something that happens all the time. Just today, there was more shelling. And so what we're seeing is it really changes your process as a journalist when you actually have put like a human aspect to what you're doing versus just hearing this data. And I think that's one of the other reasons I wanted to go there, was to get some interviews, and I'm in the process of translating some of them still, and they should be out within the week. And I got to talk to the people from Solidar, who had just been liberated, so to speak, and they were even so scared to talk to us because they have family on the other side, they have friends on the other side. To them, this isn't something that, it's just us reporting on it. This is their lives. And one of the things that I saw was how they're dealing with the process of going into being part of the Russian Federation, having to change all their documents, very human, regular stuff. And obviously the aid coming to them via food, via supplies. And it was really, it was just really impactful. And I can only say I've had a few life-changing trips. One of them was to Nicaragua, and talking to the Sandinistas, and this one, of course, was definitely one of them. Just being able to hear from them. Yes, we were in a basement. Yes, we really lived with shelling. What was done to us was inhumane. And another highlight in terms of what was most impactful, not in terms of the anything positive, but it was what was most impactful was seeing the soldiers that were liberated, the prisoners that had been tortured. There was the face of a prisoner that I'm not going to be able to forget, because his face was gaunt. There was no life in his eyes. And when he was talking about his experience, he was just very terse, and you could tell he wasn't really present. His mind was somewhere else. And that just shows you the toll that this has taken. And we don't really analyze the psychological toll, really. When we talk about this, we usually talk about the lives lost or the shelling, but really the psychological effects of living under this condition or of torture or of just constant shelling. Even just being there, the shelling became normal. When you hear it, it sounds like thunder. And people don't realize this sort of thing. And one other thing that people don't talk about is the water situation.
Right.
When you get there, there's really no running water. We went to a hotel, so there was water for 1 hour in the morning, 1 hour in the evening, but if you missed it, that's it. So you had to get gallons, and this is how people have been living for 9 years. I'm just here for a few days.
Yeah.
And so it really kind of shows you your privilege in a way of really not understanding even a fraction of what these people went through, especially as an American, because as you know, we haven't had the war on the soil.
Right.
The last time that came close to happening was Pearl Harbor, I would say. I wouldn't even say 9/11, I'd say Pearl Harbor, because it wasn't, it was another country attacking us, and obviously for different reasons, as we know, but the reality is we haven't really lived under sanctions. We haven't lacked water in that way. We haven't been living in that, which is why I think so many Americans are so desensitized from what sanctions are, what it means to live in a country that is enduring shelling, or in a region that's enduring shelling, which is why many can say, well, I'm anti-war, and so I'm pro-peace, which means Putin's invasion wasn't justified. It's like, well, no, actually, if you really talk to these people and see how they've been living, you would understand that this is literally a fight for their lives, and then greater, a fight for Russia as a whole, as its existence.
Yeah, I have to agree with you 100%. I mean, that's also one of the main things that I noticed. It's very easy to criticize Russia for making the decisions it made when you're living in a country that isn't anywhere near a military conflict, a situation like the one that exists in Donbass and has for the last now 9 years, as you said. I also find it interesting that I find this to be parallel to the way that a lot of Americans see the history of the Soviet Union as well. They just, discount it, write it off as some authoritarian regime because the government had to make authoritarian decisions sometimes and everything. But people say that because they don't understand what it was like to live in those times. Like, they don't understand, for example, in the 1930s, basically the entire West was planning to invade the Soviet Union and destroy it, as it attempted to do in 1917 and the next 3 or 4 years after, during the Civil War, when over 14 different countries from the West, including Japan actually, invaded the Soviet Union to crush the Bolshevik Revolution there. And so obviously a government is going to try to protect what it's built over the years when it's being threatened militarily from all these places all around the world. And it's super difficult to understand that when you're living in the West, when not only did your generation not have to deal with anything like that, but your parents' generation, your parents' parents' generation, it's just not in the societal consciousness of people. And going back to the Donbass conflict, one thing that has really shocked me so far, and still really surprises me, is that in wars, right, there's war propaganda, and it involves a lot of twisting of the truth on both sides in any conflict. I would say that's part of war propaganda. But just the way that I have observed with my own eyes, as you have, as you just said, that Ukraine, the Kiev regime, just says such bold-faced lies about what's going on. And you mentioned a couple examples just now. When I was there, I remember the Ukrainian military was bombing civilian installations. They were shooting artillery at places that had no military infrastructure there. And I was in some of these places. I heard the artillery going off nearby. I knew there were no military installations nearby, and these shells could not have come from Russian positions. And yet, somehow, the Ukrainian news outlets were saying that it was Russia bombing its own people in Donbass and blaming the Ukrainians on the front line between Ukrainian forces and Donbass forces at that time. It's like the most insane, unbelievable, bold-faced lies that become circulated anyway in the Western media because they're only using sources from Ukrainian media, from Kiev back to media. So I want to ask you, like, what do you think Kiev's trying to accomplish by just by doing that? What is, I mean, they must know that these are lies.
The same thing that the US State Department tries to accomplish by literally lying about every other conflict we've had. I mean, we're coming into the 20-year anniversary since the war in Iraq, and I was very young during that time, and obviously things were happening that people of our generation couldn't control. But it's the same exact playbook, and Kiev is taking its playbook from the State Department, because essentially Ukraine stopped being a sovereign country a long time ago when the U.S. interfered in their elections and orchestrated this coup. And not only did they back it, they orchestrated it. And that it was a long time coming. And Putin mentioned this recently, that this has been the goal of NATO and of the West, has been to destroy Russia. There have been countless U.S. politicians that have alluded to it. Countless documents, including the RAND document that pretty much laid out how NATO wanted to destabilize the Balkans area and the ex-Soviet neighbors and allies of Russia to destabilize it. It's the same thing that the U.S. State Department does that Kiev is doing, because it's under its jurisdiction. Essentially, we know Zelensky is just a puppet, and basically the entire government is controlled by fascists supported by the U.S. State Department. And so really, it doesn't surprise me that they lie that way, because if you go to the internet, if you go to like Twitter, and if you go to any sort of Facebook or any sort of social media, if Kiev will write, a Kiev outlet will say, "Oh my God, Russia bombed a flat with 50 people in it," and or Putin. What the recent one was, Putin bombed a bus stop where people died, and they'll just put it out there, and it'll just get so much traffic. Whereas if we put something out there, it's completely shadow banned. People don't see it. So people just see that, right? And this happened sort of to me when the whole situation with Poland happened, where they were accusing Russia of sending missiles to Poland and trying to bomb Poland. And we know that story was completely false, but every major U.S. outlet ran with it. So they say the lie enough that it becomes so repeated that people are like, "Oh, this must be true." If everybody says it, people who aren't political, people who don't really follow, and they see all over social media and all over the mainstream media, "Oh my gosh, Putin bombed a bus stop," so they just start repeating the same thing. And that's what they want. They don't care about the truth. It's about perception, and that's what media has become in the West. It's not about the truth. It's about perception. Seymour Hersh is a blogger. He's not a journalist. Everything he says, "Oh, it's just a blog." Like, discredit the witness, call them propagandists, call them pro-Putin. It's really just about making sure that narrative sticks. And if you say it enough times, and if you say it to the right people, it's just going to be proliferated everywhere. And our side of the story, and I say ours because we're here, doesn't get told. It doesn't get heard by the people that need to hear it the most, which is why, of course, RT is banned pretty much everywhere in the West. And it's you talk about war propaganda. Of course, there's going to be it's not like Russia's gonna like insult itself constantly on when it's talking about things, but CNN, MSNBC, they don't get those labels. They don't get the censorship. So it's definitely not an equal status here. And one of the things that is really frustrating to me when I deal with supposed anti-war activists or anti-imperialists in the West, in the United States, is that they're like, "Yeah, but Putin wasn't justified, and you're being pro-war by saying that Russia's special military operation, as you call it, they say is justified." And to me, it's like, for me, being an anti-imperialist means defending the people from the empire. That's literally what it means. And to me, being anti-war is stopping this empire that's waging a war against everybody in the world. And there's no denying that there is one country that is leading that, and it's really pretty much bossing everybody around, taking the entire economy of the EU, forcing the UK as well, the Five Eyes, right? And they see themselves as the entire world, and everybody else just should do whatever they say. And like, that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing the world wake up to that. And, I just want to say, Russia's standing up. And this is something that, when talking to people, when I was in Donbass, talking to some of the people that were telling us the stories and that were taking us around who live there, it's really interesting how they're so aware of what's going on, how they see the situation so clearly. And yet, in the West, we don't even have that because we don't have our history. Our history is completely just fabricated. It's completely skewed. And we don't really get a picture of that. But Russia they really highlight the fact that this is almost, I don't want to say religious, but it's like, it's definitely a spiritual war. It's definitely an existential war, in terms of the bigger aspect, not just the proxy war with Russia via Ukraine that NATO is waging, but in terms of Russia, in a way, taking the lead for other countries that haven't had the opportunity or the ability to really stand up to US hegemony. And we're seeing that, of course, played out with Africa and what's going on in the continent and how they're trying to avoid this neo-colonial side from the West. We're seeing that in Latin America and how they refuse to send weapons to Ukraine, and they say they want to be neutral, how they're trying to find de-dollarization. And so what you're seeing is the world sort of respond to this and say, okay, maybe this is an opportunity to go to this multipolar route. And that's not just a word to throw around, that's really happening.
Well, it's definitely true. I mean, based on my experience, what you said about the Donbass people just knowing what's going on, I always say they're actually cut from a different cloth from even the Russians that live in Moscow. They're really like,
Fiore blemish patches help heal blemishes in one use, so you're ready to go for it. Fiore.
the closest thing I can imagine to what the people of the Great Patriotic War were like. And I want to go back to what you said about perception, because that definitely is very important. In the West, they try to make us out as Russian propagandists, even though we're not Russian.
Yeah.
And that's sort of used to try and discredit what we're saying and everything. They say that in CNN, MSNBC, they just say RT's propaganda. It even goes as far as these, as you said, these so-called anti-war people who think that we're pro-war because we support the special military operation. But I think the exact opposite is true. We are the Westerners who actually decided we're going to leave our entire lives behind and go for ourselves and see with our very own eyes. We're given an opportunity to see the reality of the situation that no other Americans, no other Europeans have available to them. And so it becomes our duty to show these people in the West who don't have that opportunity to at least be exposed to some extent to what we've seen. So in effect, I think we're actually, we should be considered more reliant than just your average person who can talk about this stuff behind like a microphone on some podcast,
Yeah.
Because we're here and we decided to come here out of our own free volition. It's not like Russia brainwashed us.
Yeah.
We made decisions back in the West to come to certain political conclusions. And for that reason, we decided to move here and become Russian propagandists, don't you think?
Yeah, and it's not like it's, so many people agree with us, but they won't dare even come to Russia to visit, or they won't dare, even go on RT or in any way, shape, or form be affiliated because they're afraid of their career. And even that to a degree is understandable for some, but for to take the risk of like coming here and having that label and having to put up with all of these names and all of this smearing and all of the things that come with it, it's really, we're not doing it because it's fun. We're doing it because we think it's important to tell the truth. And I think that's an important thing to highlight. You're absolutely right. I mean, it takes more courage to be here and to go anywhere that you're talking about. If you're going to talk about Russia, Ukraine, you should come to the places that you're talking about as a journalist. I mean, that's my opinion. I think a lot of people need to go to the places they talk about. And that's one of the reasons why I'm here. And even just coming to Russia itself, a lot of the lies that we're told, people still think Moscow is post 1991,
Right.
you know, in the United States. That's what they have, this image of that. And then when they start saying, you know, oh my gosh, the supermarkets are full, there's no shortage of eggs, what's going on? Oh, your metro looks like a museum compared to the subway, which has rats and is just dirty and
Yeah.
it's just not as efficient. And like, and that's the most efficient transportation in New York, and you know this. And so it's crazy that people still have that perception, but how could they not have that perception when the only independent media always gets censored, always gets shadow banned? People just don't watch anything really that's anti-imperialist that much. It's hard to get people to really pay attention to that. And again, it's vilified as being authoritarian or being, you know, now it's like, okay, well, it's not just that you're, you know, they're still calling Russia communist, which is, you know, it's just like all of these things, there's such a lack of knowledge. And so it's almost like we're trying to break a giant just population that's completely been brainwashed, programmed to hate Russia. I mean, if you look back at everything that we're taught in the United States, we're taught that Russia is bad, that Putin's authoritarian. You're taught in every movie and every sort of story, Russians are always the bad guys. You know, there's never really anything good to say about Russia. And of course, with 2016, 2015, the Russiagate scandal really primed people to really be ready for this just battle against Russia. We know that they were planning to really back Ukraine and push Ukraine into NATO. That was the plan all along. So Russiagate is no coincidence. It had a purpose, and you can go back to, of course, just a long time ago, even before the fall of the Soviet Union. The plans were to really create this sort of nationalist sentiment in Ukraine and divide it from Russia. And so this is not something that began this last year. This is something that Russia entered that was already ongoing, as you said. And I think it's important people understand that. And it's so infuriating when people say, you know, you're so pro-war, how can you support? It's like, well, I support people defending themselves, you know. If especially, you know, if you're one of these Second Amendment person, which I do believe that Americans deserve the right to defend themselves with this government, especially that they have. I just think that, you know, you should understand people wanting to defend themselves. And if these people feel like they're ethnically Russian, they consider themselves Russian. In fact, many people don't want to hear that. They say, no, that Donbass was always part of Russia. It's never not been a part of Russia. So they don't know how people feel, how there's this Soviet nostalgia. You can find it in Moscow, but it's completely just different in Donbass. I mean,
way stronger over there.
Way stronger, and it's not a negative thing. It's a thing of pride. Even people who aren't necessarily ideologically communist respect the Soviet Union. They respect what it did. They have this sort of understanding of what it did and what it meant. And so there's, you know, you'll no problem seeing Soviet flags, no problem seeing all of this memorabilia. And it's really telling that in the US, oh my gosh, there was a Soviet flag at this anti-war rally. Oh my goodness, how dare they? It's like, you know, it's insane how much controversy one Soviet flag causes in the United States. Whereas here, it's like, okay, yeah, like this is, you know, it's a part of the country.
Yeah, or the fact also, I remember there was a bunch of outcry about seeing Russian flags at this rally, like thinking that these people are like either sent by the Russians or they're traitors or whatever. Meanwhile, how many Ukrainian flags do we see around the United States? Way more. This is a flag of a foreign nation that nobody cared about several years ago, and was also, you know, and still is one of the most corrupt, messed up places in Europe. Actually, nobody wants to talk about that. They're being given all these weapons, all this money, even Abrams tanks, and they're one of the most renowned, like worst when it comes to corruption, governments in the world. We're already seeing a bunch of the weapons that were handed out at the beginning of this conflict reappear in Africa in the hands of like radical Islamist terrorist groups. Already several heads of state in Africa have said that.
Yeah. And just going to the Donbass, you really learn about the history of the region as a whole, and even the city of Donetsk, and in these areas, you learn about how fertile the soil is, how up and coming this region was until, of course, this whole thing started, and how people there were really, the infrastructure was built by the Soviet Union. Ukraine never really did much for the region. And so you really learn why people feel a certain allegiance to Russia and why people feel a certain allegiance even further back to the Soviet Union and why they feel like, no, Donbass has always been Russia. And of course, like I said, it's historical too. Like it's, it's ethnically, these people feel they're Russian. So how can you deny if you're talking about sovereignty? And this is a question that, an issue that so many people don't know how to address. Is sovereignty is usually what people of the countries that US vilifies want. They want to be able to make their own decisions. They want to be able to choose who their government is, who they talk to. And that's a question that China and Russia have brought up too in the latest talks between Lavrov and his counterpart. What is the fact of what we want to go towards an independent foreign policy.
Yeah.
This is all it is. It's not about even not working with the United States. It's about working as an equal, having an equity there. That's not just a very unilateral type of situation. And I guess that can't be. And so this reaction to well, Putin, it really, even people who feel like no, they don't like NATO, they're not really propagandists. I'm still in a way because they really haven't seen what is going on here. And I tell people all the time, come to Moscow, like it's kind of difficult now, but maybe this is why you should do it. Because it's like, once you come here, even just coming to Moscow, it really does give you a different perspective. And of course, going to Donbass, you know that this is very real. You know that this is not a both sides situation. And this is something I struggle with too when it comes to Israel-Palestine, when you try to show both sides as a journalist, but for me, it's clear one side is the aggressor and the other one is the victim. This is the way I see the conflict here. It's one side is the aggressor and the others are the victims defending themselves. And I don't consider self-defense to be a bad thing. I'm not a pacifist. There's a difference between being a pacifist and being somebody that's an anti-war person, because to me, being a pacifist means you just allow yourself to get taken over or defeated or co-opted. Like that's just not, something I adhere to. But I believe in people's right to defend themselves, and the people of Donbass are doing that. And really, Russia was extremely, and I say this all the time, just restraint, showed great restraint in this whole situation, because really it took a really long time and thousands of people have died, and Russia shows the small amount of offensive or takes a more of a position of defending certain regions, and it's ambivalent. But the U.S. literally goes around killing, murdering, and it's fine. I mean, shooting down balloons. I mean, and even during the Trump administration, just killing Sam Soleimani. It's like, okay, well, I mean, it's just so unfair the way Russia's been portrayed. And I think that's also another thing that really hit me. It's like seeing all this destruction in Donbass and seeing who's really doing it, our country, the State Department, the US supplied weapons and all of that. And then on top of that, seeing Russians be vilified culturally. Like if you switch Russians with Jews, you're going to get a completely different reaction, but that's exactly what's going on. Russian literature, Russian artists not being able to perform, Russian athletes not being able to attend events, and no Russian flags anywhere, but Ukrainian flags everywhere. It's fine. And in spite of the Nazi emblems that you see on a lot of these people, in spite of all of that, it's being just justified. And Americans have long patted themselves on the back for being the country that defeated Nazis. That's what you learn in school, that the US came in there, rescued everybody, and they defeated the Nazis. But really, we know the US was supplying the weapons. The US would have gone with, if Germany had been had the upper hand, the US would have backed Germany. And that's the reality people don't want to hear. And even people who support this operation are like, no, but the reality is the Soviet Union was instrumental and lost so many lives in this, but they don't want to hear it because communism, and that word is just it's like such a bad word in the States still. And I think it's kind of ridiculous because, like I said, Russia isn't a communist country necessarily. It does have a lot of the elements of the Soviet Union, which I think is actually a positive thing.
Mhm.
It needs to be expanded, but
Yeah.
the reality is, this isn't even about, communism, I think, and despite at all, this is about just destroying Russia and then of course going toward China. And I think that's what the West really sees as it's China. And that's gonna be tougher because I don't, everything's possible.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like you said, it's not a communist country, but it's obviously like a semi-dependent country in the periphery of this cabal of Western finance imperialism, and that's the whole reason why, even if like leftists, they say, well, Russia's not communist, why do you support it? Because it's opposed to international imperialism. You should support anyone who's trying to break away from that. And like you said about Russia, the West blaming them for, after they've shown so much restraint, blaming them for finally taking, the hammer and doing something about the situation. What's even more outrageous about that is that all of that restraint they showed in trying to make the Minsk protocols work turned out to be just a farce.
Yeah.
I mean, the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel said it. The former Ukrainian president after 2014, Petro Poroshenko, said it, that these were just attempts to buy time for Ukraine so that they could prepare for an armed confrontation with Russia. This is what they had planned all the time, to destroy Comrade Vladimir Putin, as many people in America think he is, the communist leader of communist Russia, even though obviously it's been gone for 30 years, unfortunately. But I want to ask you where you think this conflict is going to go, based on what you've seen in Donbass. You've obviously been following this conflict just as closely as I have. We both work at RT. We both have been following all the news. Where do you think this is going to go?
I really don't see Russia letting up because, as I said to them, this is a fight to exist as Russians as they know it. And I think maybe the sentiment isn't as strong necessarily in Moscow, but everywhere else. And Russia isn't Moscow only; it's literally a huge country. And I think overall, more people here understand what this conflict is about than say people outside of the country. And I think this conflict is not going to end well for the United States. I don't see a way for this conflict to end well for Ukraine at all. I think the more, obviously, as Lavrov has said it, as Putin has said it, the more the US and NATO continue to supply weapons to Ukraine, long-range weapons in particular, the more they're going to push into Ukraine to defend their borders, which is absolutely normal. Who has the most military bases at people's borders? It's the United States. So I mean, Russia defending its borders should be no shock to anybody. Why wouldn't they defend their borders? They don't want to be engulfed in this whole global type of new government that the European Union wants, that the West wants, and where everybody just is under their jurisdiction. So they're going to fight, I think, for this for a while. And again, Russia showed a lot of restraint. They could be, they could have gone into Ukraine. They could have destroyed the entire infrastructure. If Russia were the US, there would be no more Ukraine and just be Russia at this point. And Russia hasn't done that because one of the reasons I think is obviously Russia would be a demon, more of a demon than it already is. But also too, Russia has no intention of doing that. They have no intention of really going into Ukraine. This isn't about Putin expanding into Europe. This has never been a goal of Russia. The idea that's been just pushed out there by the West is that Putin wants to be, Hitler and expand into Europe and control. That's actually what the United States and NATO want to do. So they're classic projectionists. I mean, they project into their adversaries what they're actually doing. And so that was never the goal of Russia. Russia just, I think, also doesn't want to hurt civilians. They've never really gone out of their way to attack civilians. They haven't, really focused on that. It's all been about the artillery, the weapons, and Russians and Ukrainians are I've talked to a lot of Russians, political, not political, and they told me this, they don't want to see Ukrainians die. They have a lot of family members that live in Ukraine, a lot of friends. It used to be a back and forth thing where you would go. And this isn't something that is something they want. And just destroying the infrastructure of Ukraine would be like destroying a part of Russia. And people don't understand that. They think Russians just sit here hating Ukrainians, and that's just not the case at all.
Right.
I haven't seen that.
It's completely not the case. I mean, I think Americans should think about it like as if, a fascist government appeared in Texas and then decided it was going to invade a different part of the United States.
Yeah.
Like, obviously, other Americans would not be like, we should wipe Texas off the map, because tons of people have family there, just like in the same situation here. Ukraine and Russia are fraternal nations.
Mhm.
There's many people who don't even consider them to be different nations. And this is why, and I know I'm not the only one who feels this way, but I feel most for the Ukrainian people, because they're the ones suffering the most throughout this, and it's not Russia, it's the United States that backed this government, this fascist government. And we see all the time in the media stuff like, oh, Russia's using prisoner soldiers, they tried to mobilize people and people are fleeing. That stuff has been going on since the beginning of Russia's military operation in Ukraine, on a scale 10 times worse. Like, men cannot leave the country, and prisoner soldiers have been used since the very beginning. I mean, I have and what a lot of people don't understand is that obviously in every country, I would say it's safe to say that the majority of the population is apolitical. They're just trying to get by. I would say that in Ukraine, a huge amount of the apolitical population is mostly getting harmed by the Ukrainian government. I've come to this conclusion because I have Ukrainian friends in the United States who are actually pro-Russia, and they've accepted refugees into their homes who were, it's a lot of times, of course, women and children, but it's also men that are fleeing conscription by the Ukrainian military. They don't, support, but they're not even actively against the government there. They just don't want to be thrown into this meat grinder that the Ukrainian military has become, and everyone knows it, and so they run, and they can only find refuge in other countries, unfortunately.
The blame, the way that's twisted is, oh, they're running away from Russia's invasion,
Right.
rather than from Ukraine's actions,
Right.
which is what you hear. And so they put all these stories about Ukrainians, but it's like, well, yes, Ukrainians are suffering, but whose fault is this? Whose actions did this lead to here? But I mean, it's really just enraging, really, when you go to these places and you see the truth, and then you see what's actually said in the media. It's just complete lies. And I've experienced that before, covering elections in Nicaragua, where we were there, and they were saying that the polling stations were closed, that they were impeding people from voting. And we were there and we were like, that's not happening. And the New York Times reporter was not even in Nicaragua writing this. And so you see, this is what they do. But it's really just a whole other thing when you go into a war zone, a conflict zone, and you see they're really just using the trauma, the war, and the how people's lives are so affected that are using that to manufacture their own narrative for political gain. It's more than disgusting. It's evil, and they get away with it too. And so it's something that I think everybody should do that has a chance to do as a journalist or as even an activist or whatever you consider yourself, to really go to these places and really places like Donbass and really try to get to the bottom of it, or even just come to Russia. Go to the places where they tell you that these are evil authoritarian regimes, because so far I have not found that to be true. I have found it to be the opposite. These people defend themselves from the authoritarian regime, which is the United States. Our people in the United States are just brainwashed. And you talk about apolitical. I agree. That's what most people are in the world, and they are just victims of their government. And that's what we see in Ukraine. And unfortunately, when they say we're going to fight to the last Ukrainian, you shouldn't be proud of that. You should be aghast, because Ukrainians are being used as cannon fodder. They're being used to justify this war with Russia, basically, by NATO. And if you want to help Ukrainians, this is something I said about the Rage Against the War Machine people who are like, oh, you're so pro-Russia. If you want to help Ukrainians, you need to stop the supply of weapons to Ukraine. You need to stop this war right now. Tell the United States, because I don't know about you, Don, and I think you might agree, but as an American, and I can only do, because I am only an American citizen, I can only do so much about my government in the United States, which I think it's the number one perpetrator of all of this damage, right? I can't, if I'm not gonna criticize China, even if I thought, oh, China did something wrong or whatever, or if I didn't agree with something Putin was saying, okay, that's fine, I don't have to. I'm an American citizen, and also my country's responsible for all of this. So if I'm gonna go oppose NATO, I'm gonna do that because I believe that is the machine that's really pushing this. And so why does your opinion even about Russia matter if you're a US citizen? What's your opinion about, China matter if you're a US citizen? You don't live there, you haven't even been there most of the time. And your opinion, sure, it can be an opinion, but as far as, saying, well, if we're gonna call America imperialist, we have to call Russia imperialist, that sort of mindset. It's like, well, but who's really doing the damage here? It's not an equal standing here. This is again a very, very clear line of who's the perpetrator and who's the aggressor and who's not.
Right. I think it's a symptom, to be honest, of living in the imperialist core. This mindset of thinking that you have to have an opinion or you're responsible for everything that goes on over the entire world. Obviously we should be worrying about what's going on with our own government and things connected to it, especially as Americans. I agree 100%. As we do have the most aggressive imperialistic government in the world, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But anyway, I want to thank you, Fiorella, for giving us the time for this interview. This is really interesting. It's good to hear that you saw a lot of interesting and eye-opening things in Donbass when you were there. So thanks again.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching our interview with Fiorella. We hope you liked it, and if you did, please leave a like, comment in the comment section, share the video, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. And if you want to go the farthest for the channel in terms of support, please become a patron on Patreon. One of the perks is that we will read your name off at the end of every video like we're about to do right now. So we want to give a very special thank you to all of our patrons. First of all, our rank and file revolutionaries, Fyodor, Jesse Toma Alpuri, Michael Iverson, Tara Mackin, Edward, Daniel Hemphill, Irf, Graham Briggs White, Robert George, Indestructible Living, John Beckett, Chris Casseroles, and Oitz. Now, we do also have a commissar, Roger Asai. A big thank you to you as well. And a big, big, big thank you to our General Secretaries, Slava and Dylan Orris. So, comrades, that's it for this video. Hope to see you in the next one, and workers of the world unite.